I no longer have a daughter." The words crashed through the grand ballroom with such force that even the string quartet near the stage lost its rhythm. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above Ohio's most prestigious charity gala. But suddenly, nobody noticed the luxury anymore. Conversation stopped. Champagne glasses hovered halfway to lips. Forks paused over expensive meals. Hundreds of guests turned toward the source of the voice they had all recognized immediately. Joshua, one of Ohio's most respected billionaires. A man admired for building an empire from almost nothing. A man known for discipline, leadership, and quiet authority. A father. His face was tight with anger as he stood beneath the golden lights, staring directly at his daughter. Sharon, 27 years old, graceful, compassionate. The same daughter he had once introduced proudly at every business gathering. The same daughter whose accomplishments he used to celebrate. Now, tears gathered in her eyes as she stood beside the man she loved. Richard. He wore a clean navy suit that wasn't custom-made. No designer label, no expensive watch. Nothing about him impressed Ohio's elite crowd. Yet despite becoming the target of every curious glance in the room, Richard remained steady. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply tightened his hand around Sharon's. The gesture was small, protective, quiet. Joshua pointed toward them. "You embarrass this family." A murmur spread through the crowd. Sharon swallowed hard. "Dad, please." "You chose this?" Joshua demanded, looking at Richard before returning his gaze to his daughter. "After everything I've built for you?" Sharon's voice trembled. "I chose someone who loves me." Joshua's jaw tightened. "A poor single father." The words struck the room harder than the music ever could. Richard lowered his eyes for a brief moment, not from shame, but to keep himself composed. Sharon squeezed his hand. "Dad, don't do this here." But Joshua's pride had already taken control. "If you walk through life beside this man." His voice sharpened. "You are turning your back on everything this family stands for." Sharon looked as though her heart had cracked open in front of strangers. Still, she lifted her chin. "If loving a good man disappoints you," she whispered, "I don't know what else I'm supposed to do." Joshua stared at her. The silence that followed felt endless. Then he said the sentence that silenced an entire ballroom. "I no longer have a daughter. Have you ever been judged because of who you loved? Have you ever disappointed the people you wanted most to make proud? Have you ever discovered that pride can wound the very people it claims to protect? Because tonight's story isn't simply about wealth. It's about a father who confused status with security, a daughter forced to choose between approval and love, and a man everyone underestimated because they only measured what he owned instead of who he was. Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of love, family, and second chances. Help us to see people through compassion instead of pride. Teach us to value character above appearances and humility above status. Heal broken relationships, soften hardened hearts, and remind us that forgiveness is often the doorway to peace. Bless everyone listening today, wherever they are in the world. In Jesus' name, amen. What nobody in that ballroom realized was that Joshua had seen Richard before. Not as Sharon's husband, not as a poor single dad, but somewhere buried inside a memory he had long forgotten. And before this night was over, that memory would change everything. Before we continue, let's take a brief moment to pray. Welcome to Love, Money, and Secret, where America's greatest stories and life lessons meet creativity and heart. If you're new to the family, we're truly grateful to have you here. And if you've been with us for a while, thank you for coming back and sharing these moments with us. Before we go any further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see this family gathered from different cities, states, and countries around the world. Also, if stories like this touch your heart, please take a second to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Those simple actions help YouTube recommend these stories to more people who need encouragement, hope, and reminders that love still matters. Now, back inside that Ohio ballroom, nobody seemed to know what to do. Some guests avoided eye contact, others openly stared, a few whispered behind carefully raised hands. Sharon stood motionless. The pain in her eyes wasn't caused by strangers judging her marriage. It came from hearing her own father reject her in front of hundreds of people. Beside her, Richard gently squeezed her hand. His voice was calm. "We can go." Sharon blinked quickly, trying to steady herself. "I didn't come here to fight," she whispered. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone," Richard replied softly. She looked up at him. Even after being insulted, even after being publicly humiliated, his first concern was her, not his wounded pride, not proving Joshua wrong, her. Richard glanced toward the exit. "We'll leave." Sharon nodded slowly. Around them, the crowd parted. The same people who had once admired Joshua's success now watched his daughter walk away from him, one careful step at a time. Joshua remained frozen near the center of the ballroom. His expression remained firm, but beneath the anger, there was something else, something he refused to acknowledge, because despite everything he had said, he had just watched the only daughter he loved choose to leave, then abandon the man standing beside her. Sharon and Richard had almost reached the ballroom doors when a voice suddenly cut through the silence. Wait, it wasn't loud, but it stopped everyone. An older member of the charity board stepped forward from the crowd. His eyes were fixed entirely on Richard. Confusion crossed his face, then disbelief. He pointed toward Richard. No, he said quietly. It can't be. The hallway outside the ballroom grew still. The older man's gaze shifted toward Joshua, and what he said next would leave one of Ohio's most powerful men unable to speak. The older board member took another step forward, never taking his eyes off Richard. The confusion on his face slowly gave way to certainty. He pointed again. This time his voice carried through the silent hallway. Joshua, I know him. Joshua frowned, irritation briefly replacing the storm of emotions, already fighting inside him. What are you talking about? The man looked from Joshua to Richard, then back again. His expression changed completely. That's the young man who saved your life years ago. No one moved, no one breathed. The words seemed to hang in the air. Joshua stared at him. What? The older man swallowed. That winter, after the charity banquet in Cleveland, your car went off. The road during the snowstorm. Joshua's face lost its color. A memory pushed its way into the present. Twisted metal, smoke, the sharp sting of blood running down his sleeve, a voice telling him to stay awake. Strong hands dragging him away from danger, cold snow beneath him, the smell of gasoline. Joshua's eyes shifted toward Richard. For the first time that evening, he wasn't looking at him as a poor single father. He wasn't looking at him as the man who married Sharon. He wasn't looking at him as an embarrassment. He was looking at a face hidden inside a memory he had buried beneath. Years of success. Joshua took a slow step forward. His voice cracked. Richard? Richard stood quietly. The same calm composure he had carried all night remained in place. He lowered his eyes briefly before meeting Joshua's gaze. Yes, sir. Joshua's hand trembled. It was you? Richard hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. Yes. The billionaire who had just disowned his daughter in front of hundreds of guests suddenly found himself unable to speak because the man he had judged by his paycheck, the man he had called a mistake, the man he had declared unworthy of standing beside Sharon, was the same stranger who had once pulled him from a wrecked car and saved his life. And standing there beneath the glittering lights of Ohio's grandest ballroom, Joshua realized something that wealth had never taught him. He had mistaken status for character. And the price of that mistake had nearly cost him his daughter. Years before Joshua stood in that ballroom and rejected Sharon in front of strangers, Sharon was simply a young woman trying to make a difference in Ohio. That afternoon, she had just finished mentoring a group of teenage girls at a local youth program. The session had been full of laughter, honest questions, and the kind of advice Sharon wished someone had given her earlier in life. One girl had asked, "How do you know when someone really respects you?" Sharon smiled and answered, "Watch how they treat you when they don't need anything from you." She did not know that those words would soon matter in her own life. After the program ended, Sharon stopped at a neighborhood bookstore to pick up a few journals for the girls. She balanced 2 books, her phone, her purse, and a cup of coffee that was clearly asking for trouble. The moment she reached for the door, the cup slipped. Coffee splashed across the front of her blouse. Sharon froze. "Oh, perfect," she muttered. "Exactly how I planned to spend my afternoon." A calm male voice spoke nearby. On the bright side, at least the books survived. Sharon turned. Richard stood a few feet away, holding a small stack of children's picture books against his chest. His clothes were simple, his shoes looked worn, but his smile was warm, honest, and slightly amused. Sharon looked down at herself, then at the books in her hand. "You're worried about the books?" Richard nodded seriously. "Books are expensive." Despite herself, Sharon laughed. "That's your first concern?" "I've learned priorities." "And coffee on a woman's blouse is not one of them?" Richard lifted one hand carefully. "I was trying not to mention that part." Sharon laughed harder, shaking her head. "At least you're honest." "I try. It saves time." He stepped closer, but not too close, and offered a handful of napkins. "From the bookstore counter. Here, for the disaster." Sharon accepted them. "Thank you. No problem." Her eyes dropped to the books he carried. "Children's stories?" Richard glanced down. "Yes. Bedtime reading. My child thinks I do voices better when the books have animals." "You have a child?" He nodded. "I'm a single dad." There was no shame in the way he said it, No performance either. Just truth. Sharon noticed that. Most men she met tried to impress her with titles, cars, or connections. Richard stood there talking about picture books and bedtime voices like, they were the most important things in the world. Something about that stayed with her. Richard shifted the books in his hands, suddenly less confident. I know this may sound strange, especially after meeting you during a coffee emergency, but would you maybe want to have dinner sometime? Sharon smiled. You don't even know my last name. You don't know mine either. That's true. So we're equally mysterious. She looked at the coffee stain, then back at him. Well, since you already survived my disaster, dinner seems fair. Richard blinked. Is that a yes? Sharon grinned. That is a yes? Sharon had been on enough formal dinners to know exactly how most of them went. Elegant restaurants, carefully rehearsed compliments, conversations that sounded more like business negotiations than genuine connection. So when Richard pulled into the parking lot of a small family-style restaurant a few evenings later, Sharon couldn't help smiling. This is your big romantic plan? She asked as they stepped out of the car. Richard walked around to open her door. I had two choices. Oh, this place. He paused. Or my kitchen. Sharon raised an eyebrow. And what's wrong with your kitchen? Richard looked genuinely concerned. My pancakes have hurt people emotionally. Sharon burst into laughter. That bad? I've apologized to smoke alarms before. By the time they walked inside, she was already enjoying herself. The restaurant wasn't impressive by Ohio billionaire standards. The booths had been there for years. The menu had small stains from constant use. Families filled nearby tables. Children colored on paper placemats. It felt alive. A waitress approached with a bright smile. The usual, Richard? He looked embarrassed. You know my order? You've been ordering the same thing for years. Sharon tried not to laugh. You have a usual? Richard sighed dramatically. I thought I was more mysterious than this. You just lost points. I never had points. You had bookstore points. Oh, good. I was worried I'd have to earn those again. As they settled into conversation, Sharon realized how easy it was to talk to him. There was no effort, no performance, no attempt to become someone he wasn't. So, Sharon asked, what do you actually enjoy doing when you're not? Traumatizing pancakes? Richard smiled. Weekend baseball games. You play? I watch and pretend I understand coaching strategies. What else? County fairs? You like rides? I like funnel cakes. Sharon laughed. Honest answer? Always. He took a sip of water before continuing. Christmas is a big deal, too. It is? Matching pajamas. Sharon blinked. You wear matching pajamas? I lose that argument every year. You could say no. I could. You don't? Richard's expression softened. Some traditions matter more than pride. For a moment, Sharon simply looked at him. He wasn't talking about promotions. He wasn't listing achievements. He wasn't describing expensive vacations or future investments. He was talking about bedtime stories, baseball games, burnt breakfasts, and embarrassing holiday pajamas, because those were the moments that shaped his life. Being a parent changes things, Richard said quietly. You stop asking what makes you look successful. What do you ask instead? Sharon replied. He smiled. What makes the people you love feel safe? Something shifted inside Sharon. Most men had tried to impress her. Richard spoke about love as responsibility, about showing up, about choosing people every single day. As their dinner stretched on, Sharon found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, and for the first time in a very long while, she realized she wasn't interested in what a man owned. She was paying attention to who he was. The thought surprised her, because somewhere between pancake jokes and Christmas pajamas, Sharon had taken the first step toward falling in love. After that first dinner, Sharon and Richard did not rush into anything. They talked, they laughed, they learned each other slowly. Richard did not try to impress Sharon with expensive places, and Sharon did not make him feel like he had to compete with the world she came from. That made everything between them feel honest. One Saturday afternoon, Richard invited her to a backyard cookout. Sharon arrived expecting something small and quiet, but the yard was full of life. Children ran across the grass. Someone was arguing near the grill about whether the ribs needed more sauce. A baseball game played, loudly from a radio on a folding table. Richard walked over with a nervous smile. You came. I said I would. I know. I just thought you might change your mind when you saw the plastic chairs. Sharon looked around and smiled. I've sat in expensive chairs with boring people. I'll survive. Richard laughed, and the tension left his shoulders. That afternoon, Sharon saw another side of him. He helped serve food before making a plate for himself. He checked on the children without making a show of it. When someone complained about money being tight, Richard did not pretend life was easy. He simply said, we stretch what we have and keep going. There was no bitterness in his voice, only patience. Later, they sat together watching a baseball game on the small outdoor television. Sharon glanced at him. "You really love baseball." "I love pretending I understand why everyone keeps yelling at the screen." "You don't understand?" "Not always." "Then why watch?" Richard smiled. "Because it gives people a reason to sit together." That answer stayed with her. Over the next few weeks, Sharon saw more of Richard's Midwestern life. Small fairs where he bought one snack and shared it like it was a feast. Simple family traditions that were not about showing off. Neighbors helping each other carry groceries. People laughing loudly without checking who was watching. She also saw the struggles. Richard counted bills carefully. He compared prices before buying anything. He said no to himself often, especially when his child needed something first. One evening, Sharon noticed him putting back an item at a store. "You wanted that," she said gently. Richard shrugged. "I wanted it. I don't need it." There was no complaint, no shame, just responsibility. That humility touched her more than luxury ever had. Richard was patient when life pressed him, devoted when things were inconvenient, gentle without needing applause. Sharon admired that. One evening, after a community event, Richard watched her laughing, with people who greeted her, like family. When they reached the car, he said quietly, "You're different around. Your people." Sharon turned to him. "Different bad?" Richard shook his head. "Different free." Sharon looked at him for a long moment, and something in her heart opened wider. As Sharon became more comfortable stepping into Richard's world, she slowly began inviting him into hers. It started with church. "You don't have to come if you're uncomfortable," Sharon told him one Wednesday evening as they stood outside her car. Richard looked surprised. "Why would I be uncomfortable?" "You've never been." "I've never been to a lot of things." Sharon hesitated. "My church family can be enthusiastic." Richard smiled. "I survived your coffee disaster and your criticism of my pancakes. Those were valid criticisms. I think I can handle enthusiastic." By the time they walked through the church doors that Sunday morning, Sharon realized she had underestimated him. People greeted her immediately. Hands reached for hugs. Voices called her name from every direction. Children rushed past adults who pretended to be annoyed while secretly smiling. Richard stood quietly beside her, taking everything in. One woman hugged Sharon before turning toward him. "And who is this?" Before Sharon could answer, Richard extended his hand politely. "I'm Richard." The woman studied him for a second, then smiled warmly. "Any friend of Sharon's is welcome here." Richard relaxed. Throughout the service, Sharon noticed him paying attention. He listened, he observed, he respected the traditions without treating them like something strange. Afterward came lunch. Soul food filled the tables. People laughed loudly while passing dishes back and forth. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about everything. Richard looked around. "This is amazing." Sharon laughed. "The food or the fact that 3 conversations are happening at once?" "Both." As weeks passed, Richard attended community events with her. He helped set up chairs before fundraisers. He stayed behind afterward to clean. He listened to stories from elders who treated Sharon like their own daughter. He never asked Sharon to become less of herself. He never questioned the pride she carried in her identity, her traditions, or the community that helped shape her. Instead, he wanted to understand. One rainy afternoon, Sharon walked out of her salon appointment and stopped in surprise. Richard stood outside holding an umbrella. "What are you doing here?" "You said rain ruins your entire week after salon appointments." Sharon blinked. "You remember that? You mentioned it 3 times." "Because it's important." "I noticed." Another time, Sharon arrived home to discover groceries waiting at her door. There wasn't a note. She didn't need one. When she checked her phone, a message waited for her. "Go be brilliant today." Those 4 words appeared before every important meeting, every presentation, every mentoring event. Simple, consistent, supportive. Richard never made grand speeches about love. He showed it through attention, through presence, through small acts that quietly said, "I see you." One evening, Sharon looked across the table while Richard talked about his day. He laughed at his own story before apologizing for talking too much. She barely heard the apology, because suddenly, with complete certainty, Sharon understood what had been growing inside her heart. It wasn't admiration anymore. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't convenience. She loved him. Not because of what he could give her, not because of what he lacked, but because every day Richard chose kindness when nobody required it. And somewhere between church hugs, grocery gestures, umbrellas, and encouraging texts, Sharon realized she had fallen completely in love. Love had changed Sharon in ways that were difficult to hide. She smiled more. The quiet exhaustion Joshua had occasionally noticed after long days seemed to disappear. She laughed during conversations instead of simply listening politely. Even the people who worked closely with Joshua began commenting on the difference. "She seems happy," someone mentioned during a business luncheon. Joshua had offered a brief nod at the time. But the observation stayed with him. Over the following weeks, he noticed other changes. Sharon stopped showing interest whenever influential families invited her to exclusive gatherings. Introductions that once would have earned polite attention now received little more than a courteous smile. At formal events, Joshua would gesture toward accomplished young men from respected circles. Sharon always found a reason to move the conversation elsewhere. One evening, after returning from another community event, Sharon walked into the family home carrying her purse and phone. Joshua was seated in the living room reviewing documents. He lowered them slowly. "You're late." Sharon glanced at the clock. "I lost track of time." "You've been doing that often?" "It happens." Joshua studied her carefully. A smile touched her lips when she looked down at her phone. That caught his attention. He set the papers aside. "Who is he?" Sharon looked up. "Who?" "The man responsible for this." "For what?" Joshua gestured toward her. "The smiling." Sharon tried to suppress a laugh. "You sound offended by happiness." "I'm serious." "So am I." His expression softened only slightly. "Who is he?" Sharon hesitated. She loved her father. Despite his strict expectations, despite the pressure that came with being Joshua's daughter, she knew how much he had sacrificed to build the life they shared. Choosing her words carefully, she answered, "His name is Richard." Joshua repeated it quietly. "Richard?" "Yes." "What does he do?" Sharon paused. "He works hard." Joshua frowned. "That isn't an answer. It's the truth." "What profession?" "He does whatever is necessary to take care of the people who depend on him." Joshua leaned back. "Family background?" "Simple." "Wealth?" "Dad." "That's not an unreasonable question." "It is when it's the first thing you ask." The room fell silent. Joshua folded his hands together. "Do you care about him?" Sharon met his eyes. "Yes." More than she intended the single word to reveal. Joshua didn't respond immediately. Instead, he began paying attention. He asked discreet questions, made quiet inquiries through trusted contacts. The answers eventually returned. Richard, 32, single father, financially struggling, working multiple jobs, no powerful family name, no company empire, no impressive social standing. Joshua stared at the information before him. Disappointment settled heavily in his chest, not because Richard had harmed Sharon, not because anyone questioned his character, but because Joshua couldn't understand why his daughter had chosen a life so different from the one he had built for her. And with every detail he uncovered, his concern slowly transformed into something far more dangerous: judgment. Joshua tried to convince himself that time would solve the problem. Maybe Sharon was simply going through a phase. Maybe the relationship would fade naturally. Maybe she would eventually realize that love alone could not sustain the future he had envisioned for her. But weeks turned into months, and Richard remained. More importantly, Sharon remained certain. One evening, Joshua invited Sharon to dinner at home. The dining room that had hosted countless business conversations suddenly felt unusually tense. He watched as Sharon pushed vegetables around her plate before finally setting her fork down. "Dad," she said carefully, "there's something I need to tell you." Joshua already knew. He had seen the determination growing in her. Still, hearing the words out loud felt different. Sharon took a slow breath. "Richard asked me to marry him." Silence. Joshua lowered his utensils. "And?" A small smile appeared on Sharon's face. "I said yes." The smile disappeared from Joshua's expression immediately. "No!" Sharon blinked. "What? No? Dad, you cannot be serious." "I am." Joshua stood from his chair. "You intend to marry a man who cannot provide the life you've always known?" "Dad, please listen." "No, Sharon, you listen." His voice rose. "I worked for decades to give you opportunities I never had. I know that. I sacrificed everything to build security for this family. And I'm grateful." "Then why would you throw it away?" Sharon pushed her chair back and stood as well. "I'm not throwing anything away. He's struggling financially. He's responsible. He's a single father. He's devoted. He has nothing." Sharon's eyes filled with tears. "He has character." Joshua shook his head. "Character doesn't pay bills." "No," Sharon answered, her voice trembling but steady. "But money doesn't guarantee kindness." Joshua stared at her. "You don't understand what you're choosing. I understand exactly what I'm choosing. You're choosing poverty over family." The words struck like a slap. Tears gathered in Sharon's eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sharon lifted her chin. "No, Dad." Her voice remained soft. "But I'm choosing love over pride." Joshua's jaw tightened. "If you marry that man, don't expect my blessing." "Dad." "You will walk away from everything I've built." Sharon swallowed painfully. "Are you asking me to choose between you and the man I love? I'm asking you to make a wise decision." You taught me to value people for who they are." Joshua looked away. "I taught you to protect your future." Sharon wiped a tear from her cheek. "Richard is my future." The room grew quiet. Joshua's face hardened. "Then I won't attend this wedding." The pain on Sharon's face nearly broke the resolve she had fought to maintain. But she nodded slowly. "I hoped you'd stand beside me." Joshua said nothing. Sharon picked up her purse. When she reached the doorway, she paused. "I still love you, Dad." His voice came after several seconds. "I love you too." But neither one knew how to bridge the distance pride had created, and for the first time in Sharon's life, she walked away knowing her. Father had chosen his expectations over her happiness. Sharon married Richard on a bright Saturday afternoon in Ohio. It was not the grand wedding Joshua had once imagined for his daughter. There were no towering floral walls, no famous guests, no luxury ballroom filled with business partners. But there was laughter, there was warmth, there was love that did not need to prove itself to anyone. Sharon stood in a simple white dress holding a small bouquet with trembling hands. She looked toward the empty space where her father should have been sitting. For a moment, her smile weakened. Richard noticed immediately. He stepped closer and whispered, "You okay?" Sharon nodded, but her eyes told the truth. "I just thought he might change his mind." Richard's face softened. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. "Don't be. You showed up." Richard smiled gently. "I wouldn't miss my own wedding. That feels rude." Sharon laughed through the sadness. "You're ridiculous. I'm nervous. You? Very." Before she could tease him, Richard's eyes filled with tears. Sharon stared at him. "You're already crying." Richard quickly wiped his face. "I'm allergic to happiness." Sharon almost bent over laughing. "Richard, we haven't even started the vows." "I know. That's the problem. There's more happiness coming." That single joke saved her from breaking down. When the ceremony began, Sharon focused on Richard's face instead of the empty chair. His love was steady, his hands were warm, his voice shook when he promised to honor her, protect her heart, and build a life with her one honest day at a time. When it was Sharon's turn, she barely made it through her vows because Richard kept wiping his eyes. "Stop crying," she whispered. "I'm trying. You are distracting me. I'm emotionally committed." A few people laughed softly. Sharon laughed too, and the heaviness lifted from the moment. By the time they were pronounced husband and wife, the joy was real. Not perfect, but real. Their marriage began without Joshua's blessing, but it began with peace. In the weeks that followed, Sharon and Richard built a modest home together. Bills still arrived, groceries still had to be stretched, Richard still worked hard, and Sharon still balanced her own responsibilities. But their home had something Joshua's mansion had slowly lost. Warmth. They cooked together, sometimes badly. They danced in the kitchen while waiting for food to finish. They argued playfully over directions, chores, and whether Richard should ever be trusted near pancake batter again. Sharon brought grace into Richard's life. Richard brought calm into Sharon's. They did not have everything, but they had each other, and for a while that was enough. Months passed after Sharon and Richard settled into married life. Their home wasn't extravagant. The furniture didn't match perfectly. Some evenings ended with simple meals and tired conversations about work, but peace had found a place there. The only shadow that remained was Joshua. Sharon still thought about him. She wondered whether he regretted missing her wedding, whether he reread the messages she had sent but never received answers to, whether he ever looked at old photographs and missed the daughter who used to sit beside him during Sunday breakfasts. Then the invitation arrived. Joshua's annual charity gala, one of Ohio's most anticipated social events. Sharon stared at it for several moments. Richard noticed immediately. "You don't have to go." She looked up. "I know. You don't owe anyone another chance." Sharon folded the invitation carefully. "He's still my father." Richard studied her face. "You think this might fix things?" "I don't know. And if it doesn't?" Sharon took a deep breath. "At least I'll know I tried." Richard reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Then we'll go together." The night of the gala arrived. Ohio's elite filled the elegant ballroom. Crystal chandeliers illuminated polished floors. Soft music drifted through conversations about investments, philanthropy, and influence. Sharon adjusted her dress nervously. Richard straightened the lapel of his suit. It wasn't expensive, but it was clean, pressed, worn with dignity. "You look handsome," Sharon whispered. Richard smiled. "Thank you. You nervous?" "A little. You'll be fine." Richard glanced toward the ballroom entrance. "That's not what worries me." Sharon understood exactly what he meant. The moment they stepped inside, people noticed. Whispers moved quickly through the crowd. Some recognized Sharon immediately. Others glanced toward Richard with curiosity. Then Joshua saw them. He had been speaking with several guests when his eyes landed on his daughter, then shifted toward Richard. The warmth disappeared from his expression. Sharon walked toward him slowly. "Dad?" Joshua looked at Richard, then back at Sharon. "You brought him here?" Sharon's voice remained calm. "He is my husband." Joshua's face hardened. "He is a mistake." Richard remained silent. Sharon tightened her grip around his hand. "Dad, please don't do this here." But months of disappointment erupted all at once. "You embarrassed this family." "No," Sharon answered softly. "I loved someone you refused to know." Joshua looked directly at Richard. "A poor single father does not belong beside my daughter." Several nearby guests gasped. Richard lowered his eyes briefly, mastering the hurt before it reached his expression. "Dad, stop," Sharon pleaded. Joshua pointed toward the ballroom doors. "If you choose him." His voice echoed through the room. "You are no daughter of mine." Sharon froze. Pain filled her eyes. Richard turned toward her. "We can leave." Tears gathered, but Sharon lifted her chin. She looked at her father one final time. "If loving a good man cost me your approval," she said quietly, "then I'll pay that price." Then Sharon chose Richard. Together, hand in hand, they turned and walked away. Sharon and Richard had almost reached the ballroom doors when a voice stopped them. "Wait." The word was not loud, but it carried enough weight to freeze the room. An older member of the charity board stepped forward from the crowd, staring directly at Richard. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Joshua turned sharply. "What now?" The man pointed at Richard. "Joshua, I know him." Richard's shoulders stiffened. Sharon looked from Richard to the man, unsure why the air had changed so suddenly. Joshua frowned. "What are you talking about?" The man's voice lowered, but everyone nearby still heard him. "That's the young man who saved your life years ago." The room went completely still. Joshua stared at him. "What did you say?" The man looked toward Richard again. "The winter after that charity banquet in Cleveland. Your car went off. The road during the snowstorm. People talked about it for weeks." Joshua's face slowly lost its color. The memory returned in broken pieces. A dark Ohio road. Snow falling hard against the windshield. Tires sliding. Metal crushing. Pain shooting through his arm. Smoke rising from the front of the wrecked vehicle. He remembered trying to move and failing. He remembered the smell of gasoline. He remembered a young man's voice telling him, "Stay awake. I've got you." Richard stood silent. He did not look proud. He did not look pleased that the truth had come out. He looked like a man who had never wanted attention for doing what he believed was right. Joshua took one slow step closer. His voice weakened. "Richard?" Richard met his eyes. "Yes, sir." Joshua swallowed. "It was you?" Richard hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The ballroom remained silent. Joshua's mind returned to that night. Young Richard had pulled at the damaged door until his hands were cut. When the door would not open, he had broken the window, reached through the sharp glass, and helped drag Joshua away from the car. Minutes later, smoke thickened. By the time help arrived, Joshua was alive because a stranger had refused to keep driving. Later, Joshua had tried to offer money. Richard had refused it. Joshua remembered the words now. "If someone needs help, you help them." At the time, Joshua had been moved by the sentence. Years had passed, business grew, wealth increased, pride hardened places in his heart that compassion used to reach. He had forgotten the face, but Richard had not changed. The same man who had stopped on a snowy road was the same man, standing beside Sharon now. The same man Joshua had insulted. The same man he had called unworthy. Joshua looked at Sharon. Her eyes were wet, but she said nothing. Then he looked back at Richard. For the first time, Joshua saw him clearly. Not as poor, not as a single father, not as a threat to his family name, but as a man with courage, humility, and character. And the truth struck Joshua harder than any public embarrassment ever could. He had just rejected the man who once saved his life. Joshua stood motionless. The same ballroom that had witnessed his anger was now witnessing something entirely different. Regret. He looked at Richard, then at Sharon. For the first time that evening, the billionaire who always knew exactly what to say had no prepared response. His voice shook. "You saved my life." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "I was just doing what anyone should do." Joshua immediately shook his head. "No." His eyes filled with tears. "Not everyone would have stopped." Silence settled over the crowd. Joshua slowly turned toward Sharon. She looked exhausted, hurt, protective of the man beside her. "Dad," she whispered. Joshua lowered his head. I failed you. The admission seemed to cost him everything. I judged the man you love by what he had instead of who he was. He looked at Richard. I called you a mistake. Richard opened his mouth. You don't have to. Joshua gently raised his hand. Please. Then he looked back at Sharon. You spent your entire life showing me what mattered. His voice broke. And somewhere along the way I stopped listening to the values I taught you. Sharon wiped away tears. You hurt me. I know. You missed my wedding. I know. You made me choose. Joshua closed his eyes briefly. I know. The room remained quiet. Then Richard leaned toward Sharon and spoke softly. You don't have to forgive him tonight. Sharon looked at him. You can take your time. Joshua heard every word. Even after everything that had happened, Richard was protecting Sharon's heart instead of demanding reconciliation. Joshua let out a small, emotional laugh. You really do love her. Richard answered without hesitation, more than anything. Later that evening, Joshua asked Richard if they could speak privately. The two men stepped onto the terrace overlooking the Ohio skyline. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Joshua broke the silence. I owe you more than an apology. Richard shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Joshua gave a sad smile. That's exactly what you told me years ago. Richard looked down. I meant it then. Joshua's voice softened. I don't know how to repay you now. Richard thought carefully before answering. Then don't repay me. Joshua frowned. What do you mean? Richard met his eyes. Just be Sharon's father again. Joshua stared at him. A man he had insulted publicly was asking for nothing except healing, for the woman they both loved. Emotion overwhelmed him. You really are a better man than I gave you credit for. Richard rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know about that. Joshua extended his hand. Richard looked at it, then shook it, but Joshua surprised them both. He pulled Richard into a hug. It was uncomfortable immediately. Richard stiffened. Are we hugging? I think so. This feels aggressive. Joshua laughed through tears. You complain a lot for someone who saved my life. I wasn't trained for emotional situations. By the time they walked back inside, Sharon narrowed her eyes, suspiciously. What happened? Joshua cleared his throat. Nothing. Richard nodded quickly. Definitely nothing. You hugged, didn't you? No, absolutely not. You both hate hugs. Neither answered. Sharon smiled through tears. You hugged. Months later, healing slowly replaced distance. Joshua attended church with Sharon. He sat through community gatherings and discovered joy in conversations that had nothing to do with business. He showed up at cookouts, lost badly during card games, accused everyone of changing the rules. You're cheating, Joshua protested. We're not cheating, Sharon replied. You've just never played against determined people. Richard leaned closer. I think they're hustling us. Joshua pointed across the table. See, he agrees with me. Laughter filled the room. For the first time in years, Joshua felt at home. Eventually, at another gathering, Joshua stood proudly beside Sharon and Richard. Someone asked about the man standing next to his daughter. Joshua smiled. This is my son-in-law. He looked at Richard, the man who saved my life twice. The person beside him blinked. Twice? Joshua glanced toward Sharon before answering. The first time, he pulled me from a wrecked car. His eyes softened. The second time, he looked at his daughter. He brought my daughter back to me, and that became the story people remembered. Not the rejection, not the humiliation, but the grace that followed. Before we go, tell us where you're watching from and share the lesson that touched your heart the most, if this story reminded you that character matters more than status. Please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Love, Money, and Secrets so we can continue bringing meaningful stories into your home. Because sometimes, the richest people in the room are not the ones with the largest bank accounts. They're the ones who choose love when pride tells them not to.